He said, "Do your job. Don't think about who I am, just think about what's right." Malcolm chuckled softly, a rare sound that seemed to lighten the tension, if only for a moment. "I wrote him a ticket. He didn't like it, but he respected it." Brian glanced at the ticket book clipped to his belt, his fingers itching to grab it but hesitating. "Is that what you want me to do?" he asked cautiously. Malcolm's smile faded, replaced by a serious expression. "What I want isn't the point, Carter. The question is, what do you think is the right thing to do?" Brian's heart pounded as he tried to process the situation. The words felt like another test, one that forced him to confront not just his actions tonight, but his own values as a cop. Did he believe in fairness, in treating everyone the same, no matter who they were? Or was this about survival, about keeping his head down and avoiding conflict? The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Ryan looked at Malcolm, searching his face for some kind of clue, but the captain's expression remained unreadable. "All right," Brian said finally, pulling out his ticket book. His hands trembled slightly as he began to write, the pen scratching against the paper like a drumbeat in the still night air. When he was done, he handed the ticket to Malcolm, who accepted it without a word. For a moment, Ryan thought he saw a flicker of approval in Malcolm's eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Thank you, Officer Carter," Malcolm said, his voice neutral. "I'll take care of this." With that, he turned and got back into his car, leaving Brian standing there, his mind racing. Had he done the right thing? Or had he just made the biggest mistake of his career? As the black sedan pulled away, disappearing into the night, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter wasn't over. Malcolm Hayes wasn't just a man who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. There was something else going on, something Brian couldn't quite put his finger on. Back in his patrol car, Brian sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the ticket book in his lap. He thought about the captain's words, about accountability, about doing the job right, no matter who was on the other side of the badge. It wasn't just a lesson for the night. It felt like something bigger, something that would stay with him for a long time. As he started the car and pulled back onto the highway, Ryan couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that tonight was just the beginning. Whatever had brought Malcolm Hayes to that road, at that hour, in those circumstances, it wasn't random. And Brian had a sinking feeling that he was about to find out why. Ryan's shift dragged on, but his mind never left the encounter with Captain Hayes. The captain's words echoed in his head, looping endlessly. He replayed every moment, Malcolm's calm demeanor, the way he emphasized accountability, the strange timing of it all. Something didn't add up, and the more Brian thought about it, the more uneasy he felt. What had brought his captain to that stretch of highway, speeding alone in the middle of the night, and why had he seemed almost expectant, as if he knew this would happen? The next morning, Brian dragged himself into the station, exhausted and jittery. The usual buzz of activity filled the air, phones ringing, officers chatting, the occasional burst of laughter. To everyone else, it was just another day. But to Brian, everything felt off. He couldn't shake the feeling that his encounter with Malcolm was far more significant than it appeared. As he made his way to his desk, a voice called out, "Carter, heard you had an interesting night." Ryan turned to see Officer Morales, his longtime partner and closest friend on the force, leaning against the wall with a knowing smirk. "Word travels fast around here," Morales added, folding his arms. Ryan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I pulled over Captain Hayes. It wasn't exactly a highlight of my career." Morales raised an eyebrow. "Pulled over and gave him a ticket. Man, you've got guts. Or a death wish." "Maybe both," Brian muttered, dropping into his chair. He glanced around the room, half expecting Malcolm to walk in at any moment. But the captain's office door was closed, and there was no sign of him. "You think he's mad?" Morales asked, his tone casual but curious. "I don't know," Brian admitted. "He didn't seem mad. If anything, he seemed, I don't know, like he wanted me to do it. Like it was some kind of test." Morales frowned. "That's weird. Hayes isn't usually one for games. He's pretty straightforward." "Exactly," Brian said. That's why it's bothering me. Something about the whole thing felt off. And why was he out there in the first place? It's not like that's his usual route. Morales shrugged. Maybe he just wanted some peace and quiet. Or maybe there's something going on that we don't know about. The idea lingered in Brian's mind long after Morales walked away. What if there was something going on? Malcolm's behavior wasn't just unusual, it was deliberate. And whatever his reasons, Brian had a sinking feeling they were about to become his problem too. Later that afternoon, Brian's suspicions deepened when he was called into Malcolm's office. The captain was sitting at his desk, a cup of coffee in hand and a stack of papers spread before him. He looked up as Brian entered, gesturing for him to close the door. "Have a seat," Malcolm said, his tone neutral but carrying the weight of authority. Brian obeyed, his palms sweating as he tried to gauge the captain's mood. Malcolm's expression was unreadable, his eyes sharp and focused. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence thick with tension. "I want to talk about last night," Malcolm said finally, setting his coffee down. Ryan's heart raced. "Yes, sir." "You handled yourself well," Malcolm continued. "You followed protocol, treated me like any other driver, and made the right call. That's exactly what I expect from my officers." Ryan blinked, surprised by the praise. "Thank you, sir. I just wanted to do my job." "I know," Malcolm said, his gaze steady. "And that's why I'm telling you this. There are times in this job when doing your job will put you in difficult situations. Situations where the line between right and wrong isn't as clear as you'd like it to be." Ryan nodded slowly, unsure where this was going. "I understand." "Do you?" Malcolm leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. "Because there's something you need to understand, Carter. Last night wasn't just about a speeding ticket. It was about trust. About knowing that I can count on you to do what's right, no matter who's in front of you." Ryan swallowed hard. "I'll always do my best to uphold that, sir." "Good," Malcolm said, leaning back in his chair, "because I might need you to prove it again." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Ryan's stomach churned as he tried to process what Malcolm was saying. Was this a warning, a prelude to something bigger? Before he could ask, Malcolm's phone buzzed, interrupting the moment. He glanced at the screen and sighed. "We'll talk more later," he said, dismissing Brian with a nod. "For now, just keep doing your job." Brian left the office feeling more confused than ever. Malcolm's words replayed in his head, each one carrying a weight he couldn't ignore. What did he mean by prove it again? And why did it feel like this was only the beginning of something far more complicated? Over the next few days, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Conversations around the station grew quieter when he walked by, and he noticed more than a few sideways glances from his fellow officers. Even Morales seemed unusually distant, brushing off Brian's questions with vague answers and forced smiles. Then, one night during his shift, Ryan's radio crackled with a call that made his blood run cold. 10 to 50 on Route 9, the dispatcher announced. "All available units respond." Ryan's hands tightened on the wheel as he flipped on his siren and sped toward the scene. Route 9, the same stretch of road where he pulled over Malcolm. The coincidence felt too strange to ignore, and as he approached the scene, his worst fears were confirmed. The black sedan was there, its front end smashed against a tree. The driver's door was open, but there was no sign of Malcolm. Other officers were already on the scene, combing the area with flashlights and shouting his name. Brian's heart pounded as he stepped out of his car, joining the search. Where was Malcolm? And what had brought him back to this road? As the night stretched on and the search grew more desperate, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't an accident. Something had drawn Malcolm here, something he hadn't told anyone about, and whatever it was, Ryan was determined to find out. Brian's flashlight cut through the dense trees lining Route 9 as he joined the search for Captain Hayes. The night felt suffocating, the air heavy with unanswered questions, and the sound of voices calling Malcolm's name. Every step Brian took felt deliberate, his boots crunching against the dry leaves as he scanned the woods for any sign of movement. The black sedan's smashed front end replayed in his mind. It didn't make sense. Malcolm was too careful, too deliberate in everything he did. An accident? No, this was something else. Anything? Brian asked Morales, who appeared out of the darkness, his face etched with worry. Not yet, Morales replied, shaking his head. No blood in the car. No sign of a struggle. It's like he just vanished. Brian frowned. That doesn't make any sense. You don't just walk away from a crash like that. Morales looked around nervously, lowering his voice. Maybe he didn't walk away. Maybe someone took him. The thought hit Brian like a punch to the gut. He had considered foul play, but hearing Morales say it out loud made it real. And if someone had taken Malcolm, the question was, why? Carter. A voice called from further up the road, pulling Brian's attention. Another officer was waving him over, her flashlight fixed on something half hidden in the brush. Brian's pulse quickened as he hurried over, his mind racing with possibilities. When he got there, the officer pointed silently. At first, Brian didn't see it, but then the beam of his flashlight landed on a single object, a cell phone. Its screen cracked, lying face down in the dirt. Brian's breath caught as he recognized the black leather case with the department's insignia embossed on the back. It was Malcolm's. Carefully, Brian picked it up, his gloved fingers brushing off the dirt. He pressed the power button, but the screen remained dark. The phone was dead. He glanced around, his eyes narrowing. Why would Malcolm's phone be out here, away from the car? And why did it feel like someone had deliberately left it there? We need to widen the search, Brian said, his voice tense. This isn't just an accident. The officers nodded, splitting into groups to comb the area. As Brian moved deeper into the woods, his thoughts churned. Who would target Malcolm, and why? The captain wasn't the kind of man to make enemies easily, but then again, in their line of work, enemies had a way of finding you. The deeper Brian went, the darker the forest seemed to grow. The sounds of the highway faded, replaced by the eerie stillness of the trees. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch made him jump, his senses on high alert. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone out here, that someone, or something, was watching him. His flashlight caught on something in the distance, and he froze. There, tangled in the branches, was a piece of fabric. He stepped closer, his heart pounding. It was a torn piece of a dark blue shirt, the same color Malcolm had been wearing the night Brian pulled him over. Captain Hayes, Brian called, his voice echoing through the woods. There was no response, only the unsettling silence that seemed to press in on him. He grabbed the fabric, turning it over in his hands. It was damp, but not with blood. Water? Sweat? He couldn't tell, but it sent a shiver down his spine. As he continued searching, Brian's radio crackled, breaking the silence. "Carter, come in," the dispatcher's voice said, sharp and urgent. Brian fumbled with the radio. "Carter here. Go ahead." "There's been a development," the dispatcher said. "We received a call from an anonymous tip line about Captain Hayes. The caller didn't leave a name, but they said the captain was involved in something bigger than anyone realizes. Said he had a reason for being on Route 9. Brian's grip tightened on the radio. What kind of reason? Caller didn't say. Just said we should check that abandoned warehouse off Old Mill Road. Brian's stomach churned. The warehouse. It had been empty for years, a decaying structure left over from a logging company that had shut down decades ago. It was the kind of place you avoided unless you had a reason to be there, and none of those reasons were good. "I'm heading there now," Brian said, already turning back toward the road. "Send backup." "Be careful," the dispatcher said before the line went dead. By the time Brian reached his patrol car, his nerves were shot, his mind racing with possibilities. What could Malcolm have been doing out here? What was so important that it led him to this place, alone and in the dead of night? And who had made that call? The drive to the warehouse felt longer than it should have, every mile stretching out like an eternity. The forest seemed to close in on him, the trees casting long shadows across the road. When he finally pulled up to the warehouse, the sight of the crumbling structure sent a chill down his spine. The place was as foreboding as he remembered, its windows shattered, the roof sagging under years of neglect. Brian killed the engine and stepped out, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. The night was deathly quiet, the only sound the crunch of gravel under his boots as he approached the building. He tried the main door, but it was locked. Circling the perimeter, he found a side door hanging off its hinges, the rusted metal groaning as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. His flashlight beam danced across broken machinery, stacks of rotting wood, and graffiti-covered walls. The place looked abandoned, but Brian knew better than to trust appearances. He moved cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. "Captain Hayes," he called, his voice breaking the silence. It felt wrong to speak, as if the very act of making noise would invite danger. But there was no answer, only the oppressive stillness. As he ventured deeper into the warehouse, his flashlight caught something on the floor. Drag marks, faint but unmistakable, leading further into the building. Ryan's heart pounded as he followed them, his senses on high alert. The marks led to a door at the far end of the warehouse, partially ajar. Brian approached it slowly, his hand tightening around the grip of his gun. He nudged the door open with his foot, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. What he saw made his blood run cold. The room was small and cluttered, its walls lined with old filing cabinets and shelves. In the center of the room was a chair, its legs bolted to the floor. Ropes dangled from its arms, frayed and cut, as if someone had recently been tied there. A single, faintly bloody handprint marked the edge of the chair. Ryan's breath caught in his throat as he scanned the room, his mind racing. Malcolm had been here, he was sure of it, but where was he now, and who had brought him here? As Brian stepped closer, a sound behind him made him spin around, his flashlight jerking wildly. He thought he saw a shadow move, quick, deliberate, but when he pointed the light, there was nothing there. The room was empty, or was it? "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice shaking slightly. No response, just the echo of his own voice bouncing off the walls. And then, from somewhere deep within the warehouse, he heard it. A faint, muffled cry for help. The faint, muffled cry echoed through the warehouse, faint yet chilling. Ryan's heart raced as he strained to pinpoint its direction. He steadied his flashlight, the beam slicing through the shadows. Every instinct told him to move cautiously, but the urgency in the sound propelled him forward. Someone was here, someone who needed help, and deep down, he knew it had to be Malcolm. "Captain Hayes," Brian called, his voice low but firm. The sound didn't come again, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. He moved toward the noise's general direction, weaving through rusted machinery and stacks of discarded wood. Each step felt heavier, the floor beneath him creaking like it might give way. As he rounded a corner, his flashlight caught something unexpected, a set of fresh footprints in the dust. They were uneven, like whoever left them had been stumbling or dragging something. Brian's breath caught. He wasn't alone. Someone had been here, possibly very recently. The footprints led to a metal staircase spiraling down into the basement. The air grew colder as he descended, the smell of damp earth and rust growing stronger with each step. His flashlight flickered briefly, and he froze, his pulse hammering in his ears. He tapped it against his palm, and the beam steadied, but the momentary darkness left him shaken. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement opened into a labyrinth of narrow hallways and low ceilings. Pipes lined the walls, dripping water that echoed eerily in the confined space. Brian moved cautiously, his flashlight darting across the graffiti-scarred walls. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified by the oppressive quiet. Then he heard it again, faint but clearer this time. A muffled voice, strained and desperate. It was coming from his left. Ryan quickened his pace, his footsteps reverberating through the hallway. He turned a corner and stopped short. Ahead of him, a door stood slightly ajar, the faint glow of a flickering light spilling out from the room beyond. Ryan approached the door, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. He pushed it open with the toe of his boot, revealing a small room illuminated by a single swaying bulb. In the center of the room was Malcolm, tied to a chair, his face pale and his uniform disheveled. His eyes widened when he saw Brian. "Carter." Malcolm's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "It's a trap." Before he could finish, the door slammed shut behind Brian with a deafening clang. He spun around, but the handle wouldn't budge. Panic surged through him as he pounded on the metal, his shouts echoing in the confined space. From the shadows, a voice emerged, calm and cold. "You should have stayed out of this, Officer Carter." Ryan froze, his flashlight darting across the room, searching for the source of the voice. A figure stepped into the dim light, their face partially obscured by a hood. They carried themselves with a deliberate, calculated confidence that sent a chill down Brian's spine. "Who are you?" Brian demanded, his voice steadier than he felt. The figure chuckled darkly. "Someone who's been watching you. Watching both of you." Brian glanced at Malcolm, who was struggling against his restraints, his face etched with frustration and fear. "What do you want?" Brian asked, his hand hovering near his weapon. "What I want," the figure said, stepping closer, "is justice. Real justice. Not the kind your department pretends to uphold." Brian's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the situation. The figure's words were loaded, laced with anger and bitterness. "If you have a problem with the department, why take it out on him?" Brian asked, gesturing toward Malcolm. "What's he got to do with this?" "Oh, he's got everything to do with it," the figure sneered. "Your beloved Captain Hayes isn't as noble as you think. Ask him about his cases that disappear. Ask him how many people he's silenced to keep his spotless reputation." Ryan's stomach twisted. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. He turned to Malcolm, who avoided his gaze, his jaw clenched. "Is that true?" Ryan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Malcolm didn't answer. His silence was louder than any denial could have been. The figure took a step closer, their face now fully visible under the flickering light. They were younger than Brian expected, their eyes blazing with a mix of rage and pain. He thought he could bury the truth, they said, their voice trembling with emotion. But not this time. This time, the world will see him for what he really is. Brian's mind reeled. Was Malcolm guilty of what this person claimed? The captain he respected, the man who had taught him about integrity and accountability, could he really have a darker side? And if he did, what did that mean for everything Brian thought he stood for? Before Brian could respond, the figure reached into their pocket and pulled out a small device. They pressed a button, and a low, mechanical hum filled the room. The walls seemed to vibrate slightly, the sound growing louder with each passing second. "What is that?" Ryan demanded, his voice rising with urgency. "Insurance," the figure said, backing toward the door. "By the time anyone finds this place, it'll be too late, for both of you." Panic surged through Brian as the figure slipped out of the room, slamming the door behind them. The mechanical hum grew louder, reverberating through the walls. Brian rushed to Malcolm's side, fumbling with the ropes that bound him. "We have to get out of here," Brian said, his voice shaking as he worked to free Malcolm. "Now." Malcolm nodded, his usual composure replaced by raw fear. "Carter, listen to me," he said, his voice urgent. "There's more to this than you know. If we don't make it out of here—" "Save it," Brian snapped, his adrenaline spiking. "We'll deal with that later. Right now, we need to move." The last rope came loose, and Malcolm staggered to his feet, wincing as he stretched his stiff limbs. Together, they turned toward the door, racing themselves for whatever lay beyond. The hum had reached a deafening pitch now, the vibrations making the floor feel unstable beneath their feet. As they pushed the door open and stepped into the hallway, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The hallway stretched out like a dark tunnel, the low hum now accompanied by faint tremors beneath their feet. Brian and Malcolm moved quickly, their breaths coming in short bursts. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound magnified in the tense silence. Brian's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragmented story that had unfolded. Who was that figure, and why were they so determined to take down Malcolm? And what was the device they had left behind? "Where do we go?" Malcolm asked, his voice strained as he glanced over his shoulder. Brian scanned the hall, his flashlight flickering. "We find the way out. Fast. Keep moving." They turned a corner, the walls narrowing as the vibrations grew stronger. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the space, and part of the ceiling crumbled, sending debris crashing down behind them. Brian grabbed Malcolm's arm, pulling him forward. This place is falling apart, Malcolm said, his voice rising in panic. No kidding, Brian shot back, his eyes darting around for an exit. His flashlight caught a glint of metal. A service ladder bolted to the wall, leading upward. There, we can get out through the roof. They ran to the ladder, and Brian gestured for Malcolm to climb first. Go, I'll cover you. Malcolm hesitated but didn't argue. He grabbed the rungs and started climbing, his movements slow and labored from exhaustion. Brian followed close behind, the tremors growing stronger with each passing second. As they neared the top, a deafening explosion ripped through the building. The blast sent a shockwave that rattled the ladder, nearly knocking them off. Heat and smoke filled the air, making it hard to breathe. Brian gritted his teeth, pushing himself upward until they emerged onto the roof. The night sky was a stark contrast to the chaos below, the cool air biting against their sweat-soaked faces. They stumbled onto the roof, coughing and gasping for air. Below them, the warehouse was consumed by fire, the flames licking at the walls and sending plumes of smoke into the air. We're not safe yet, Brian said, his voice hoarse as he looked around. The rooftop stretched out, but there was no obvious way down. We need to find. A voice cut through the chaos, stopping him mid-sentence. Not so fast. Ryan and Malcolm spun around to see the hooded figure standing near the edge of the roof, their face illuminated by the glow of the flames. In their hand was a small device, its red light blinking ominously. You thought you could just escape? The figure said, their tone cold and mocking. You haven't even begun to pay for what you've done. Brian stepped forward, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon. You need to stop this, he said, his voice firm. Whatever you think he's done, this isn't the way to handle it. The figure laughed bitterly. You really think this is about thinking asterisk? I have proof that your precious captain is a fraud, a liar, and worse. They turned to Malcolm, their voice sharp with accusation. Tell him, Hayes. Tell him about the people you've buried, the cases you closed just to save your career. Malcolm didn't respond, his expression grim as he stared at the figure. Ryan's stomach twisted. He wanted to believe Malcolm, to trust the man he had looked up to for years. But the silence was damning. What's the proof? Brian demanded, keeping his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. The figure smirked, holding up a flash drive. Everything is on here. Names, dates, evidence he suppressed. I made sure it can't disappear this time. Brian's eyes narrowed. If you have proof, why go to these lengths? Why not just take it to the authorities? The figure's face darkened. Because the authorities protect their own. People like him. They pointed at Malcolm, their hands shaking with anger. No one would listen. No one ever listens. Ryan took a cautious step forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. I'm listening now. Give me the drive, and I'll make sure the truth comes out. The figure hesitated, their resolve wavering. But before they could respond, Malcolm spoke, his voice low and steady. You're right, he said, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. I've made mistakes. I've done things I'm not proud of. But this isn't justice. It's revenge. The figure's eyes flashed with fury. Revenge. You ruin lives. You don't get to talk about justice. Ryan watched the exchange, his mind racing. He could see the conflict in the figure's eyes, the way their hand trembled as they held the device. They weren't a hardened criminal. They were someone who had been pushed too far, someone who believed this was their only option. In a swift move, Ryan lunged forward, grabbing the device from their hand. The figure stumbled back, stunned, as Brian secured the flash drive in his pocket. It's over, he said, his voice firm. No more games. But the figure wasn't done. They pulled a small blade from their jacket, their desperation boiling over. Brian stepped back, his hand on his holster, but before he could act, Malcolm moved between them. Stop, Malcolm said, his voice commanding. Enough. The figure froze, their grip on the blade tightening. For a moment, it seemed like they might strike, but then their shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of them. The blade clattered to the ground, and they sank to their knees, sobbing. Brian stepped forward cautiously, securing the blade before looking at Malcolm. What now? He asked, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Malcolm looked at the figure, Then, at Brian, "We do what we should have done all along," he said. "We tell the truth." The final twist came as they descended the ladder, the warehouse collapsing behind them. As Brian handed the flash drive to the authorities, a thought nagged at him. If Malcolm was willing to face the consequences, what other secrets might still be buried? For now, the night was over, but the story was far from finished. The highway was eerily quiet that night, its usual buzz replaced by the soft hum of cicadas and the occasional roar of a passing car. Officer Brian Carter leaned against his patrol car, sipping a lukewarm coffee while keeping a watchful eye on the stretch of road ahead. The night shift was always long, often uneventful, but tonight something felt different. He couldn't quite place it. Maybe it was the full moon or the strange tension that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Brian wasn't new to the job. At 32, he had spent nearly a decade in law enforcement. A small-town cop with big city dreams, he took pride in his uniform and believed in the principles it stood for. But the last few years had been hard. The news was filled with stories about police officers and their encounters with citizens, particularly black men, that had gone horribly wrong. Ryan often found himself caught in the middle of heated conversations, at home, at the station, even within himself. He believed he was one of the good ones, the kind who did the job right. But tonight, his beliefs were about to be tested in a way he never imagined. Just as he took another sip of his coffee, the headlights of a sleek black sedan pierced through the darkness, speeding past him. Instinct kicked in. He tossed the coffee onto the ground, jumped into his patrol car, and hit the lights. The sirens blared as he pressed down on the accelerator, the adrenaline surging through him like it always did during a traffic stop. Inside the sedan, Malcolm Hayes glanced in the rearview mirror and let out a long, frustrated sigh. He wasn't speeding, not really, but he knew this was about more than just the speedometer. As a black man in America, Malcolm had learned the hard way that being careful wasn't always enough. He eased the car to the shoulder, his heartbeat quickening as he rehearsed the steps he practiced too many times before. Hands visible, no sudden movements, calm voice. He had taught these same steps to his teenage son, Daniel, just a few weeks ago. The irony was not lost on him. Brian approached the car cautiously, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on Malcolm's hands, which rested on the steering wheel exactly where they should be. "License and registration, please," Brian said, his tone firm but not unkind. He couldn't see Malcolm's face clearly through the tinted windows, but he could sense something. Was it fear? Frustration? He couldn't tell. Malcolm slowly rolled down the window, his face calm, but his eyes guarded. "Sure, officer. It's in the glove compartment. May I reach for it?" His voice was steady, but Brian detected the slight edge to it, the kind of tone that said, "I've done this before, and I know how it goes, Brian nodded, watching closely as Malcolm moved deliberately, retrieving the documents and handing them over. Something about the man's voice struck a chord with Brian, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. There was a sense of authority, of control, almost as if this man was used to giving orders rather than taking them. As Brian scanned the license, the name hit him like a jolt. Malcolm Hayes. The name was familiar, almost too familiar. His hands froze for a moment, the flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. Could it be? No, it couldn't. But as he glanced back at Malcolm, the realization began to dawn on him. "Step out of the car," Brian said, his voice now carrying an unmistakable note of unease. Malcolm raised an eyebrow, his calm composure barely shifting. "Is there a problem, officer?" "Just step out, please." Ryan's heart was racing now, though he tried to hide it. The odds were slim, impossible, even, but if his hunch was right, this would be the most surreal moment of his career. Malcolm hesitated but complied, opening the door and stepping into the cool night air. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, and his presence commanding despite the casual jeans and polo shirt he wore. Ryan's breath caught as the streetlights illuminated Malcolm's face fully. There was no doubt now. Standing before him was not just another citizen, not just another driver. This was Malcolm Hayes, the police captain of their very own department. For a moment, Neither man spoke, the weight of the moment pressing down on them like an invisible force. Brian's mind raced, trying to piece together how he had ended up in this situation. Did Captain Hayes recognize him? What was he supposed to do now? Apologize? Pretend he didn't notice? And why had the captain been driving alone at this hour on this road? Malcolm, for his part, didn't say a word. He simply stood there, studying Brian with an expression that was hard to read: disappointment, amusement. Brian couldn't tell, and that only made the silence more unbearable. Finally, Malcolm broke the tension with a single pointed question. "So, Officer Carter, what happens now?" Brian opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. What did happen now? He had no idea, but whatever it was, he knew it was going to change everything, for both of them. Brian stood frozen, the weight of the moment sinking in as he stared at Captain Malcolm Hayes. His mind reeled with questions. What was the captain doing out here? Why hadn't he said anything yet? Most of all, how had he not recognized him sooner? The man who now stood before him wasn't just his boss. Malcolm Hayes was a figure Brian respected, a leader who carried himself with dignity, a voice of reason in a job that often felt chaotic and thankless. Yet here he was, pulled over like any other driver. Malcolm's question hung in the air, demanding an answer Brian wasn't sure he could give. What happens now? It was a simple enough query, but its implications felt enormous. Brian fumbled for words, his mouth dry, the flashlight in his hand feeling heavier by the second. "Well, Captain." He began, but Malcolm held up a hand, cutting him off. "Let's skip the formalities for now, Officer Carter. I'm just another man in front of you tonight. Treat me like you would anyone else." His voice was calm but firm, the kind of tone that left no room for argument. Brian swallowed hard, nodding slightly. He felt a strange mix of respect and unease. Was this a test? A setup? It wasn't like Malcolm to play games, but something about the whole situation didn't sit right. He decided to do what he always did: follow protocol. At least that way, he couldn't be accused of favoritism or disrespect. "All right," Brian said, his voice steadier now. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Malcolm tilted his head slightly, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I'm guessing it has something to do with my speed." Brian nodded. "That's correct. You were going 10 over the limit." 10 over. Malcolm repeated, almost as if testing the words. His smile didn't fade, but his eyes carried a sharpness that made Brian's stomach twist. "Fair enough." Brian shifted his weight, feeling the awkwardness grow. Normally, this was the part where he'd issue a warning or a ticket, depending on the situation, but this wasn't a normal situation, and Brian knew it. He also knew Malcolm wasn't going to make this easy for him. "License and registration check out," Brian said after a beat. "Everything's in order." "Good to know," Malcolm replied. He crossed his arms, his posture relaxed but his gaze unwavering. "So, what's your next move, officer?" Brian hesitated. Every option felt like a trap. Let him go, and it might look like he was playing favorites. Write a ticket, and he'd risk offending the captain. He could already imagine the whispers at the station. Carter pulled over Hayes. "What an idiot!" Before he could decide, Malcolm spoke again, his tone softer now. "You're nervous, aren't you?" Ryan blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I'm just trying to handle this the right way, sir." "There's no need to be nervous," Malcolm said. "I'm not here to make your job harder. I know what this looks like, Carter, but I want you to remember one thing. The badge doesn't make you immune to mistakes. It doesn't put you above accountability." Ryan nodded slowly, unsure how to respond. The words felt like both advice and a warning. Malcolm continued, his voice taking on a reflective tone. "You know, when I was a rookie, I pulled over my own sergeant once. He was speeding too, just like me tonight. I remember standing there, just like you are now, wondering what the hell I was supposed to do. And you know what he told me?" Brian shook his head, his curiosity piqued despite himself.